What if, during the final battle against Kaguya, Naruto was pulled into a place that should never have existed? A forgotten void older than chakra itself. A realm sealed away by the Sage of Six Paths, hidden from gods, Otsutsuki, and even history itself. But Naruto did the one thing no one was ever supposed to do. He touched the seal. And for 11 terrifying seconds, he connected with the original current of existence, a force so ancient that anyone who touched it was erased forever. Anyone except him. Now, something impossible lives inside Naruto Uzumaki. A power beyond chakra, beyond tailed beasts, beyond the gods themselves. And somewhere in the darkness, ancient eyes have finally awakened. This is the story of what happened when Naruto became the vessel of Ryukan.
Sky was
the Dragon
wrong.
Soul.
That was the first thing Naruto Uzumaki noticed. Not the bone-white landscape stretching in every direction, not the absolute and total silence pressing against his eardrums like cotton soaked in cold water. Not even the fact that his shadow clones had dissolved mid-motion the instant he tumbled through the portal. The first thing he noticed was that the sky above him had no color at all. Not black, not white, not the bruised violet of a dimensional rift or the sickly green of Kaguya's ashbone world. It was the precise and absolute
He reached
color
inward, toward the vast warmth that had lived behind his sternum for as long as he could remember. The enormous amber presence that growled and burned, and occasionally grumbled about his diet. He found it immediately, found the great fox curled in his familiar place in the architecture of Naruto's chakra. But there was something different about him. Something that took Naruto a full moment to identify, because he had never encountered it in Kurama before. Kurama was still. Not sleeping, not resting, not in that low, conserving rumble he sometimes dropped into during long periods without combat. Still. The way an animal goes still when it hears something in the dark that it cannot identify and is not certain it can outrun. Kurama? Naruto pushed the thought inward, careful and quiet, the way you'd speak to someone standing on a ledge. A pause. Then, I'm here. You okay? Another pause. Longer this time.
That was
Define.
not a reassuring answer. Naruto filed it under deal with in 30 seconds and forced himself upright, turning in a slow circle to assess his surroundings. The space, he couldn't call it a world, not yet, because it lacked the fundamental texture of a world, stretched in all directions without horizon. The ground he stood on was the pale, cracked porcelain surface, extending outward until it either ended or became indistinguishable from the nothing-colored sky. There was no visible light source, no sun or moon or torch. The faint luminescence simply was, sourceless and even, casting no shadows. Everything he could see had that same washed-out quality, as though this place had been sketched in pencil and never colored in. There was no wind. This, Naruto realized, was what truly set his teeth on edge. He had been in dimensional spaces before. Kaguya's various worlds each had their own ambient sensation, a wrongness that you felt in your back teeth and the hinge of your jaw. This was different. Kaguya's dimensions felt hostile, felt like spaces that wanted you to leave. This felt like a space
to open
that
a portal
simply didn't
himself,
notice him.
attempted to channel the Six Paths chakra Hagoromo had given him into the familiar reaching sensation that preceded dimensional movement. Nothing happened. The chakra moved fine within him, responded to his will, circulated normally, but the moment he tried to push it outward, toward the membrane of this space, it simply absorbed, sank into the ambient nothingness like water into dry sand. No resistance, no feedback, just gone. He tried 3 more times with the same result. Right, he thought. Not getting out that way. He began to walk. The silence had texture. This was something Naruto discovered within the first few minutes of walking, and it disturbed him more than the visual emptiness. Silence in the real world was always approximate. There was always something underneath it. The distant movement of air or water or living things, the faint mechanical hum of a world in motion. This silence was absolute, in a way that made his footsteps sound obscenely loud. The soft scuff of his sandals against the pale ground,
he thought again.
Talk to me. What is this place? This time, Kurama responded more fully, though his voice in Naruto's mind had none of its usual textured authority. It was quieter than normal. Careful. I don't know exactly, but I know what it feels like. What does it feel like? The fox was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his tone had something in it that Naruto had never heard from him in all their years together. Something that lived in the same county as dread. It feels like the time before there was anything to feel. Before chakra had a path or a purpose or a name. Like standing in the room where something was made, before anyone had decided what it was going to be. Naruto processed this. Is that bad? In the way that standing too close to the edge of everything is bad? Yes, probably. Great, Naruto thought, with the particular brand of exhausted humor that had carried him through more crises than he could count. Fantastic. Really reassuring, buddy. Kurama made a sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a nervous exhalation. Don't crack jokes. I need you paying attention right now. That landed. Naruto straightened up, all levity evaporating. In all the years since their true partnership had formed, through the war, through the long and difficult months of learning to genuinely trust each other, he had never heard Kurama say, "I need you," in that register. That wasn't the fox being dramatic. That was the fox being scared and choosing
Naruto
honesty
thought,
over pride.
and his focus sharpened to a point. I'm paying attention. Tell me what you need me to see. Look at the walls. There are no walls. Look harder. Naruto went still. He dropped into that particular mode of perception that Sage Mode had taught him. The deep, receptive quiet, where you stopped projecting and started receiving, where you let the world come to you instead of reaching for it. He let his eyes unfocus slightly, let his awareness expand outward in that slow, breathing way that Fukasaku had drilled into him until it became reflex. And he saw them. They weren't on walls exactly, because the space didn't have walls in any architectural sense. They were on the boundary of the space, running along the inner surface of whatever separated this void from the dimensions that surrounded it, like writing on the inside of a shell. Vast, geometric, profoundly ancient-looking characters, each one enormous. The smallest he could see was approximately the size of a house. The largest disappeared upward into the nothing sky, its top edge invisible. They weren't glowing with any aggressive light. They were simply there, integrated into the fabric of the space, the way grain is integrated into wood. Not painted on, not carved. I've never
seen
seen
script
script like it. Not the kanji of standard shinobi notation. Not the complex cipher forms of Uzumaki Fuinjutsu. Not the flowing cosmological notation he'd briefly glimpsed in the stone tablets of the sage. These were older than all of that. They had a quality he couldn't put into logical terms. Something about the geometry of them felt prior to human thought. The way that certain mathematical truths feel not invented, but discovered. "What are those?" he breathed. "Seals," Kurama said, and his voice was flat in that specific way that meant he was suppressing something large. "Old ones. Very, very old ones." "How old?" "Older than me. Older than the tailed beasts. Older than the Sage of Six Paths." A beat. "Naruto, those aren't seals to keep something in. They're seals to keep something out. Or more specifically, to keep something from being found." Naruto stared at them,
His eyes moved along one of the nearest characters, tracing its geometry. Something about the act of looking at it directly felt strange. Not painful, not like the feedback from an active genjutsu, but like trying to read text that was also watching you back. A sensation of mutual regard, except one party was infinitely larger than the other.
I don't know the
What are
full
they
answer,
keeping
Kurama
hidden?
said, but I know what it feels like, standing here. And it feels like whatever is on the other side of those seals is the thing that was here before anything else was anything. Before chakra had a shape or a system. Before it was divided and named and given to people and creatures. The original current. The source. He paused. Naruto, don't go near them. I'm not going near them. I mean it. I know what your instincts do when you see something sealed. Don't. I'm literally standing still. Your hand is already moving. Naruto looked down. His right hand was, in fact, moving. Not under conscious direction, but with the slow, curious drift of a thing being pulled towards something it recognized on a level below thought. His fingers were extended, reaching slightly toward the nearest glyph. He hadn't noticed himself doing it. He stopped, pulled his hand back, and shoved it into his jacket pocket with deliberate force. I wasn't doing that on purpose, he said, and even in his own internal voice he sounded unsettled. I know, Kurama said. That's what worries me. Whatever's behind those seals is reaching through them slightly, just enough to pull at things with resonance. Me and you... What? You resonate very loudly, Naruto. You always have. It's part of what you are. Your chakra is enormous, and it's loud in the way that a bell is loud. It carries. Whatever's behind those seals can hear you standing here, the way you'd hear a brass bell in a quiet room. Naruto stared at the glyphs. His heart was beating faster than the situation had strictly warranted. Somewhere behind his ribs, below the level of anxiety or adrenaline, there was something else. Something warmer and stranger, like the feeling of standing in front of a door and knowing, before you opened it, that the room on the other side was going to change you. He hated that feeling, because he'd learned to trust it completely. I'm going to stay right here, he said. I'm going to figure out how to get back to Sasuke and deal with Kaguya, and then we're going to leave this place and never think about it again. Good. Kurama said.
Those seals are warning seals,
Naruto said, despite himself. Not containment seals. You said it yourself. Which means whatever's on the other side isn't dangerous in the trapped monster sense. It's dangerous in the don't let anyone find this sense. Those are the same thing, you impossible child. They're really not. Naruto was quiet for a moment, still staring. What would happen if someone broke them? Hypothetically. The pause before Kurama answered was the longest yet. Hypothetically, the fox said slowly. I think the barrier between this pocket space and whatever lies beneath it would dissolve. And whatever has been sitting behind those seals since before the world was organized into the world we know would have direct contact with whoever was standing in this space. Direct contact, Naruto repeated. Don't. I'm just thinking. Naruto. I will rattle around inside your chakra system so hard your feelings will come loose. I don't have feelings. And if you take another step toward those glyphs, I will personally... He hadn't consciously decided to walk forward. That was the truest accounting he could give, then or later. It wasn't a decision in the way that decisions usually worked, with some sequence of reasoning leading to a conclusion, leading to action. It was more like the moment when you're standing beside a river and you realize your feet are wet, and only then do you understand that you walked into it. The choice had already happened in some layer of him that operated below language and logic, and his conscious mind was simply receiving the news. He was standing 6 inches from the nearest glyph before Kurama's furious internal shouting fully registered. Up close,
The character was overwhelming in a way that it hadn't been from a distance. Not visually overwhelming. It didn't flash or pulse or emanate anything aggressive. The overwhelming quality was more dimensional, for lack of a better word. It had depth that the eye couldn't process correctly. Staring at it directly gave the sensation of staring at something that had far more interior than its exterior suggested, like peering into a cup and finding a cavern. The geometry of it kept almost resolving into meaning and then sliding away, the way a word sounds strange if you repeat it too many times, until the familiarity dissolves and it becomes pure sound. He could feel something on the other side of it. He was sure of that, with a certainty that bypassed thought. Not a presence in the way that a person or a creature was a presence. Nothing with will or intent or hunger. Nothing that wanted anything. More like standing near a waterfall with your eyes closed. The fact of something vast and continuously moving felt through the skin before it was understood by the mind. It's not dangerous.
Naruto hesitated. His fingers were an inch from the surface of the glyph. He thought about Sasuke, who was somewhere in another dimension right now, probably being extremely competent and extremely irritable about Naruto's absence. He thought about Sakura and Kakashi-sensei and the others waiting back in what felt like a distant, sunlit reality. He thought about the village, about the faces of people he loved, stacked up in his mind like the most important library in the world. He thought about all of that. And then his fingers made contact with the glyph. The sequence of events happened in a time frame that regular perception was not equipped to process. The glyph shattered. Not with sound. There was no sound, not even in this place, but with a quality of ending that was almost violent. The fracture spread from his fingertip outward across the surface of the boundary, hairline cracks racing through the ancient sealwork in geometric patterns, each crack spreading to the next glyph and the next, a cascading dissolution of barrier work that had stood for longer than human memory. The pieces didn't fall. They simply stopped being there, blinking out of existence the way morning stars go out. Not dramatically, just suddenly absent. And then the barrier was gone. And what came through was not a monster, not an entity, not a god or a spirit or force with any kind of particularity. What came through was something that Naruto could only ever later describe as a current. It hit him the way a wave hits something standing in shallow water. Not with violence exactly, but with the absolute indifference of mass and momentum. It didn't target him. It didn't select him. It simply moved, because it had always moved, because movement was the only thing it had ever done in the infinite length of its existence. And he was in its path, and so it moved through him. The sensation defined every framework he'd ever developed for processing extreme experiences. It wasn't pleasure. It wasn't Kurama's warmth, or the crystalline clarity of Sage Mode, or the thunderous power of Six Paths Chakra. It was more like suddenly understanding that every experience he'd ever had, every sensation, every emotion, every moment of connection or loss or joy or grief had been occurring inside a room, and the wall of that room had just disappeared. And outside the room was not another room, or a landscape, or anything describable. Outside the room was everything that the room had been made from. He felt his shadow clones, not just the ones he'd made during this battle, but the theoretical possibility of every clone he'd ever made or ever would make, as individual points of light in a field that had no horizon. He felt Kurama, not as a presence behind his sternum, but as something woven through every strand of his chakra simultaneously. He felt the 5 great nations as a collection of living signatures, distant and distinct, each person a particular note in a sound that had no end. He felt Sasuke somewhere in the dimensional space nearby. Not fought toward it. He simply recognized himself. The way you recognize your own handwriting without having to analyze it. The specific arrangement that was him.
The loudness and the warmth and the stubbornness and the grief and the laughter and the ramen and the orange jacket. And the faces of his friends held close as the most important thing he'd ever been given. It was all still there, intact, spinning in the current like a compass that wouldn't give up its true north. The current moved through him and around him, and with the entirety of its ancient, directionless momentum. And Naruto Uzumaki remained exactly, specifically, unmistakably himself. The light vanished. He hit the porcelain ground on both knees, gasping like he'd been underwater, his hands slamming flat against the pale surface. Every nerve ending in his body was alight with something that would take weeks to fade. Not pain, not quite, but a resonance, the way a bell still vibrates long after the striker has moved away. His vision had whited out completely and was slowly resolving back into the familiar world of color and depth and dimension. He was back in the void. The glyphs were gone. The boundary was dissolved.
Did a slow inventory. Chakra? Present. Altered in some way he couldn't immediately quantify. Still his, still responsive, but with something underneath it now, like a melody that had gained a new bass note. Body? Intact. No new injuries, though his hands on the porcelain surface were trembling finely. Mind? Present. The full accounting of himself was there. Every memory. Every face. "I think so," he said. "I think I'm okay." "You should have listened to me." "Yeah," Naruto agreed. "I really should have. I'm going to be insufferable about this forever." "That's fair." Naruto exhaled slowly, pushing himself upright. His legs felt strange. Not weak exactly, but different, as if the muscles had been recalibrated to some new standard. Kurama. What was that? "I don't know its name," Kurama said, and his voice was still quieter than usual, still holding that careful, shocked quality. "The oldest memories I have, and my memories go back to before your civilization built its first permanent structure, don't name it. The oldest things I remember don't name it. They just acknowledge it. The way you acknowledge gravity. It's not a thing with a name. It's the thing that was here before names existed." It felt like... Naruto started.
"No,"
and then stopped.
Kurama agreed.
Because the vocabulary...
It wasn't sad. It was just... true. They were both quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough for either of them to mark. Then Naruto realized something. He looked down at his right hand, the one that had touched the glyph. He turned it palm up. His shadow, the one cast by the faint ambient luminescence of this space against the pale ground. It moved. Not with his body. He was standing still, perfectly still, but independently. A slight shifting, a slow orientation, like a compass needle finding north. It pointed toward him. It curled slightly at the edge nearest his feet, as though something in it was reaching back toward the body it was attached to. He stared at it. It went still. Regular shadow behavior. Inert.
He stared at his shadow for another moment. It was still now, perfectly ordinary, doing exactly what shadows were supposed to do. "Is that bad?" he asked. "Ask me again when we're home," Kurama said. The way back to the main battlefield opened on its own. There was no drama to it. No shaking ground, no collapsing walls, no theatrical dimensional rupture. The space simply presented him with a door. Not literally a door in any physical sense, but a thinning in the membrane of the void. A place where the boundary between this space and the familiar fabric of Kaguya's battle dimension had grown permeable, as though whatever had occurred with the current had loosened the overall dimensional architecture in this region. He stepped through it without hesitation, and the transition was nothing like falling through a portal. It was more like turning a page. One moment the pale, silent void, and the next the
sensory chaos of an active battlefield. The ash and bone dimension materialized around him in a rush of sensation so overwhelming after the utter silence of the void that he staggered slightly. Sound slammed back in. The distant concussive crack of Sasuke Susanoo, the sharp percussion of Kaguya's bone spears, the wind of dimensional currents, the distant shout of Sakura and Obito managing the seal preparation. Light returned with the aggressive quality of an active battlefield. Shadows and flashes, and the deep reddish ambient glow of Kaguya's
he was back
world.
yet. He reached for his Six Paths chakra, standard operating procedure, the first resort toolkit for Kaguya-level engagement, and found it exactly where he expected it, responsive and powerful, flowing cleanly through his pathways. But underneath it, there was something else. He felt it the way you feel a new tooth coming in. Not painful, not exactly, but present in a way it hadn't been before. A warmth below his regular warmth. A current below his chakra current. Like a river with a deeper channel running beneath it. One that moved according to different rules than the surface flow. He filed it with the shadow observation under Deal With Later and launched himself across the terrain. Sasuke saw him coming before Kaguya did. That Rinnegan never missed anything. And for a fraction of a second, Naruto saw his partner's gaze flick from him and then sharpen. Not the sharp recognition of "you're alive," though that was in there too. Something more careful, more analytic. Sasuke, who had spent their entire relationship learning to read Naruto's specific energy signature the way you learn to identify a piece of music you know very well, had noticed something different immediately. Naruto gave him a quick nod that meant "I'll explain later," and turned his full attention to Kaguya.
He didn't use whatever the current had left in him during the remainder of the engagement. He didn't need to. The combination of Six Paths chakra and Sasuke's Rinnegan and the combined efforts of everyone present was sufficient, in the end, for what needed to be done with Kaguya. The sealing process was brutal and exhausting and took another 40 minutes of sustained, coordinated effort. But it worked. It worked because it had to work, because they were them, and they did not lose. Not today, not to her. When Kaguya's form finally fractured and collapsed into the sealing matrix that Hagoromo had designed and they had executed, the silence that followed was of an entirely different quality than the void silence. This was the silence of things that had been very loud, suddenly stopping. The ringing quiet of a bell after the strike.
Somewhere else. I noticed. Sasuke's tone had that particular precision he used when he was choosing every word carefully. Where? Some kind of void space. Something redirected my portal mid-transit. That's not how portals work. I know. Sasuke was quiet for a moment. Then, when you came back, your eyes. Naruto turned to look at him. Sasuke had the Rinnegan active, which meant he was being thorough, which meant he was more concerned than his voice suggested. What about them? Briefly, Sasuke held his gaze with that level, unhurried scrutiny. Your pupils were gone. Pure gold. No marking. No pattern. Just gold. Edge to edge. He paused. I've cataloged every ocular transformation I've ever encountered or researched. That wasn't in any of them. It wasn't a technique. I know. It felt ambient, like weather. Sasuke deactivated the Rinnegan, which was, coming from Sasuke, a gesture of trust, putting away the analytical eye and just looking at his partner directly. What happened in there? Naruto was quiet for a long moment. He looked out across the devastated terrain of the battle dimension, at the resting forms of the shinobi who had fought here, at the broad and exhausted sky of this world. Something old, he said. Really old. Kurama can explain it better than I can right now. Sasuke absorbed this with his characteristic economy of reaction.
I'm working on the certainty part.
Sasuke gave him the look. The flat, long-suffering look that was the most affectionate thing in Sasuke Uchiha's entire emotional repertoire, and said nothing else. They began moving toward the others. The debrief and the extraction and the long process of returning to the primary dimension, getting everyone through the portals, accounting for injuries, managing the logistics of aftermath, consumed the next several hours with the relentless practicality that followed any major engagement. There was no space in the immediate aftermath for the kind of long, careful conversation that what Naruto was carrying in him required. There was only the next task, and then the next, and then the medical assessment, and then the debriefing, and then the first long exhalation of something that cautiously resembled done. He functioned well through all of it. His chakra was intact and responsive. His thinking was clear. The slight physical strangeness, that recalibrated feeling in his limbs, the new bass note under his chakra flow, was subtle enough that it didn't register in any of the standard assessments. Sakura, running her preliminary medical check in the field, found the laceration on his forearm and the bruised ribs and called them both acceptable given the circumstances. Her diagnostic chakra found nothing anomalous in his systems beyond depletion, which was expected. Because whatever had changed was below the level that Sakura's diagnostic chakra was calibrated to detect. He understood this in the way he was increasingly understanding.
That would come later. Over many late evenings and many cups of tea, pieces assembled gradually, as Naruto himself gradually understood what had happened to him. But as they walked together in the loose, tired formation of people moving away from a battlefield, he fell into step beside Sasuke and said quietly, "I touched something in there, in the void. There were seals, and Kurama told me not to touch them, and I touched them anyway." "Sasuke, of course you did. Whatever was behind the seals, it went through me. I think it left something. I don't know what yet." Sasuke was quiet for several steps. "Dangerous? I don't know. Destabilizing? I don't know." "Are you going to find out?" "Yeah." Another quiet several steps. "Tell me when you know," Sasuke said. "And until then, don't do anything with it without telling me first." "That's not really... Naruto." "Fine." They walked in silence for a while after that, the comfortable silence of two people who had been through enough together that quiet had stopped being awkward and become instead a form of communication in its own right. He slept that night in a field medic's tent, on a cot that was too narrow for his shoulders, under a canvas roof that let in the cold air. He fell asleep the way he always fell asleep after major engagements, immediately, completely, dropping into unconsciousness like a stone into still water.
He did not expect to dream. He dreamed. The dream had the quality of the void, without being the void. The same sourceless luminescence, the same absolute quiet, but warmer, as though the temperature of the space had been adjusted for human habitation. He stood in it and knew he was dreaming, and couldn't wake up, which was either a property of the dream or a decision he'd made in some sleeping layer of himself. A figure appeared. He knew the figure immediately. The shape was unmistakable. The staff, the distinctive silhouette, the way the ambient light seemed to treat him as a natural center of gravity. He'd seen this person twice before, briefly, during the war. Both times had been significant in ways that were still reverberating. Hagoromo Atsutsuki, the sage of 6 paths, the strongest person who had ever lived, as far as anyone in the history of the world had been able to determine. Standing in Naruto's dream with an expression on his face that Naruto had not seen during either of their previous encounters. He looked worried. Not afraid, exactly. Hagoromo, in Naruto's experience, occupied an emotional register that was above fear in the way that mountains are above footpaths. Not unreachable, but simply operating at a different scale. What was on his face was something else, something more granular and more human. It was the expression of someone who had spent a very long time maintaining certainty about something
and had just
He
received
looked at
information
Naruto
that
for a
required
long,
fundamental-
speechless moment, and then he said, in a voice that was quieter and rougher than either of their previous exchanges, stripped of its usual oratorical weight, "You were not ready." 4 words, carrying the weight of something much older than their surface meaning. Not accusation, not disappointment, but a kind of staggered, wondering statement of fact. The way you'd say the river was cold after waiting and unprepared. An accounting. Naruto looked at him steadily across the dreamed space. "I never am," he said. "That's never stopped me before." Hagoromo's expression shifted, something moving across his face that was complex enough that Naruto couldn't fully parse it in the few seconds before the dream began to dissolve, lightening around the edges in the way dreams do when sleep is ending. What he could read of it was not simple. It had grief in it, and relief, and something that looked, though Naruto wasn't sure he was reading it right, a great deal like fear. Not for himself, for Naruto. The dream let go. He woke up in the medic's tent, early morning cold pressing through the canvas, the distant sounds of camp life beginning their daily cycle around him. He lay on the too narrow cot and stared at the canvas ceiling and breathed carefully and evenly, inventory taking as he always did. Chakra, body, mind, all present, all accounted for. He turned his right hand over and looked at his palm in the gray morning light. Where his fingers had touched the glyph in the void, there was a mark, faint enough that you would have to know to look for it, luminescent only in complete darkness, geometric in the way the glyphs had been geometric, a single character pressed into the skin of his palm like a brand that hadn't burned.